I have revisited hundreds of crime scenes, reviewed thousands of hours of audio, spoken to mothers who begged for truth and fathers who begged for justice. But there is something about the night of August 8th, 2013, something about the hollow stretch of Highway 277 in Bronte, Texas, that still crawls beneath my skin. This is not just a missing person case. This is a collision between fear, chaos, and silence. A silence so heavy it swallows the desert. I arrived in West Texas long after the case had gone cold. Rumors had fossilized into myths, and myths had become the only truth some people believed. But I do not listen to myths. I listen to absence, and the night Brandon Lawson disappeared was defined by nothing but absence. Before we follow the last steps of Brandon's life, I must take you there. Not through photographs, not through diagrams, but through the feeling of the land as it breathes after midnight. When the wind slips across the highway, it sounds like the whisper of a secret no one is allowed to hear. The road seems endless even in daylight, but at 2 in the morning it becomes an entirely different creature, a creature with no patience for human fear. Brandon was 26, a father, a worker, a man with flaws and a man with dreams, a man trying to be better. On the evening he vanished, he had argued with his girlfriend. Not a volcanic argument, not something that should have rearranged the universe, but enough for him to walk out the door, his chest heavy and his thoughts storming. He jumped into his truck and pushed it into the night. But fate or bad timing or something else entirely had drained his gas tank. Just after midnight, he found himself stranded on the right shoulder of Highway 277. Imagine the darkness. Not the soft darkness of a suburban street, the real darkness of rural Texas, where the horizon is a line swallowed by blackness. His truck lights glowed like a wounded animal. Every part of the environment signaled danger even before any danger arrived. The next hour of his life is a puzzle made of fear. At 12:53 a.m. he called 911. The call lasts 41 seconds, but those 41 seconds are among the most haunting pieces of audio I have ever heard. Brandon's breathing is frantic, but controlled enough to form words that change everything about this case. I ran into them. Please hurry. Who were they? What did he collide with that made him believe his life was in danger? Investigators, family members, and internet sleuths have debated for years whether he meant he bumped into someone, witnessed something, or understood something he should not have. When I first listened to the recording, I isolated the audio track, removed the background interference, and replayed the breaths, the pauses, the tremors. The tone of his voice does not match intoxication. It does not match confusion. It matches threat. A very real threat. After calling 911, he contacted his brother Kyle. During their call, Brandon insisted someone was chasing him. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was running into the night. Running into the brushland that stretches from the highway to the Colorado River Basin like a fractured maze. Kyle and a sheriff's deputy arrived at the truck around 1:10 a.m. The engine was quiet. The lights were still on. The door unlocked. But the man who had been inside moments earlier was nowhere. If you have ever searched for someone in the Texas scrub at night, you know it is nearly impossible to vanish without leaving something behind. A footprint, a broken branch, a sound, anything. But the land around the truck was still, almost too still. I walked the same route years later, tracing every step investigators believed Brandon had taken. The terrain is uneven, carved with hidden drops and cruel vegetation. The brush is thick enough in places to claw at skin. With only the highway lights behind you and nothing ahead of you, the darkness becomes almost physical. It presses against the lungs. It manipulates the mind. The first time I stepped into the field where Brandon supposedly ran, I understood why he sounded the way he did on the phone. The night itself can feel like a predator. But there must have been something more than darkness that night, something that forced a man to flee a working vehicle and plunge into a wilderness that could kill him. Each piece of this case contradicts the others. The call indicates danger. The truck indicates no struggle. The terrain indicates a fatal accident is plausible. The search results indicate something is missing. The human element indicates panic that cannot be explained by imagination alone. A detail many overlook is that the region near Bronte is used by hunters, off-roaders, and occasionally by people transporting things they prefer unobserved. Do I believe Brandon stumbled into criminal activity? Possibly. But what haunts me is the lack of human trace on the ground. If he was chased, why did only one set of tracks ever appear? Did the pursuers arrive by vehicle and stop before the grass? Did they leave before the sheriff arrived? Or was the fear something internal rather than external? I have interviewed dozens of people who have experienced drug-induced paranoia. Their voices do not sound like Brandon's. Their fears are chaotic, irrational, and shifting. Brandon's fear was focused. He believed someone specific was after him. He believed he had seconds to escape. Even more compelling is that he called 911, which people caught in hallucinations rarely do with such clarity. When I stood on Highway 277 in the same position as his truck, the silence hit me like a weight. The wind carried dust against my clothes. The road hummed with emptiness. If I were alone, there on foot, and felt that someone was watching me, I would not walk, I would run. But run where? The brushland is not a place you survive easily if disoriented. The desert does not forgive fear. It multiplies it. Search teams combed the area with helicopters, thermal imaging, dogs, volunteers, and trained officers. They found nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a puddle of blood, not a dropped phone. It is almost supernatural how thoroughly the land concealed him. Over the years, I have learned that Texas can swallow a man whole, but not without leaving a scar on the earth. And yet here, the earth stayed untouched. For nearly a decade, Brandon remained missing. His absence became a legend in the true crime community. Some believed he was murdered. Others believed he was hiding. Still others believed he simply succumbed to exhaustion and injury. But most stories lacked what I seek when I reopen a case, motive, sequence, and evidence. In 2022, human remains were found in an area close to where Brandon had vanished. DNA confirmed they belonged to him. The discovery answered one question at the cost of 100 new ones. Why was he not found in earlier searches when the area had supposedly been cleared? How could a body remain unnoticed in plain proximity? Did environmental conditions hide him, or did someone move him? Was the discovery coincidental or intentional? When I stepped into the brush, where his remains were eventually found, I felt a strange remorse for the silence that had held him for 9 years. A silence so complete that even professionals could not break it. How does a man disappear without a sound, without a struggle, without a trace? How does fear pull someone off the highway and into the mouth of the desert? My job is not to dramatize events. My job is to seek patterns, motivations, and outcomes. And the pattern here, although fragmented, suggests Brandon was responding to a real fear. The motivation behind his flight remains unknown. The outcome is now tragically confirmed. But the story is far from complete. What happened on Highway 277 is the collision of panic, environment, and a threat that has yet to be named. I believe Brandon died not because he made a foolish choice, but because he believed he had no choice at all. Whether the threat was human or imagined under duress is still uncertain, but his reactions align with someone who believes death is seconds away. I continue to listen to the 911 call, not because I expect new words to appear, but because the pauses speak louder than the syllables. Fear shapes breath differently. Stress sharpens tone. Brandon's voice carries both. He was not merely scared, he was terrified. The desert remembers everything. It holds secrets the way a mother holds a sleeping child, quietly, firmly, unwilling to let go. When the wind moved across the grass, near where Brandon's body was eventually found, I imagined the whispers as fragments of his final thoughts. A man alone. A man running. A man hoping the lights of the highway might save him. But sometimes the highway saves no one. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it consumes. This is only the beginning of the story. A night that spiraled into legend. A man swallowed by fear. A mystery that refuses to unravel. And I intend to unravel it. The deeper I went into the case of Brandon Lawson, the more I realized that everything hinged on a single piece of audio. 41 seconds that tore a hole in the night and revealed the raw edge of a man's fear. People often assume that a missing person case begins at the moment of disappearance. But this one began the moment Brandon opened his mouth on that 911 line. His words were not random. They were not confused. They were not the ramblings of someone who had lost grip on the world. His words were a distress flare fired into total darkness. When I replayed the call inside a silent room, away from the world, away from traffic, away from the hum of machines, I heard something I had not heard before. It was not the content of the call. It was the shape of his breath. Panic has a rhythm. Fear has a temperature. Brandon's voice carried both, but also something else. Urgency mixed with clarity. He was running, but he was aware. He was terrified, yet purposeful. That combination is rare. People lost in hallucinations do not speak with such intention. People who are drunk do not maintain that level of directional thought. People who fabricate danger do not call 911 with oxygen-starved lungs and voice cracks that match the acoustic patterns of physical exertion. This was a man who believed death was following him. I decided to break the call down into microseconds. It is something I do only in cases where the voice is the final witness. Brandon's voice was not just a plea for help. It was evidence. Evidence of struggle. Evidence of movement. Evidence of something he perceived as hostile. The wind in the recording carries a strange character. It is not a gentle breeze. It is the kind of wind created when a person is running fast, breathing hard, and the phone shifts rapidly between positions. You can hear it flare and drop, flare and drop. Every flare suggests a change in direction. Every drop suggests a moment when he shielded the phone against his face or clothing. He was not walking. He was sprinting. The way he says the word them is telling. His voice dips at the end, not in confusion but in certainty. He does not stumble on the word. He does not hesitate. He says it like he has already identified the subjects and is simply naming them to the dispatcher. But here lies the paradox of this entire case. No one else saw anyone. When Kyle arrived at the truck, there were no other vehicles parked nearby. No tire tracks that did not belong to law enforcement or family. No scattered debris. No hurried footprints indicating men chasing another man. It was as if Brandon had been running from ghosts. But ghosts do not make a man call 911, and ghosts do not make breathing sound like desperation. I have reconstructed enough cases to know that perception can be as lethal as reality. If a man perceives danger, his body reacts the same way it would to actual danger. Cortisol spikes, heart rate rises. Decision-making narrows, the survival brain takes over. But something about this case resists the easy explanation of perception alone. Something pushes me to consider that Brandon was responding to a threat with shape, form, and intent. He says the phrase, "I need the cops," with a tone that tells me he believed the threat was not only immediate but external. The words are clipped. They carry no ambiguity. You do not ask for police when you are confused. You ask for police when you are cornered. I began searching through call logs of the region that month, not because I expected overlap, but to understand the context of rural Texas distress calls. They are often predictable: animal attacks, vehicle breakdowns, domestic disputes. But the tone of this call was unusual, even for the database. People rarely reach this level of fear without a visible cause. There is another moment in the recording many miss, a faint tremor when he says his location. It is not the tremor of confusion. It is the tremor of someone glancing over his shoulder while speaking, someone expecting the worst. What makes this case strange is that every emotional signal in the audio suggests Brandon was being pursued, while every physical signal at the scene suggests he was not. The divergence between these two lines of evidence is what has kept the case alive for so many years. When I walked the area the first time, I put myself into his shoes, into his lungs, into his heartbeat. I started at the truck and ran the same direction he was believed to have run. The night was quiet enough to hear my own breath. The brush clawed at me. The darkness ahead swallowed everything, and at one point, something inside me shifted. I realized how impossibly terrifying it must have been to be alone there, feeling watched. Even without a pursuer, fear becomes a predator. But fear alone does not explain everything. There is a specific detail in the timeline that demands closer examination. When Kyle called Brandon back shortly after arriving at the truck, Brandon answered. His voice, according to Kyle, carried fear, but also pain. He said he was bleeding. He said he was in the field. He said he could see lights. But he also said something baffling, something investigators have never been able to interpret clearly. He mentioned someone hiding in the woods. This statement becomes the hinge of the case. Was he describing a real person? Was he describing a shadow? Was he describing a hallucination induced by exhaustion, dehydration, or a possible come-down? Or was he describing something he truly saw? I returned to the location in daylight. The field looks completely different without the mantle of night. It stretches open, wide, exposed. There are not many places for a person to hide. The bushes cluster low to the ground. The trees are sparse. The land feels honest, but at night, honesty gives way to menace. Shapes loom where none exist. Distances distort. The imagination, fired by adrenaline, fills in the gaps. But what if the gaps that night were not imaginary? When the deputy arrived, he briefly searched the area. Procedurally, it was not yet a missing persons case. Cars stranded on the highway are not uncommon. He had no reason to believe anything criminal was unfolding. But hindsight reveals something unsettling. If Brandon was still alive in the field at that moment, watching the lights of his brother and of law enforcement, why did he not emerge? Why did he not shout? Why did he not run toward the road that represented safety? The answer lies in one of two possibilities. Either he was too injured to move, or he believed the threat was between him and the people trying to find him. This is the detail that changed my perspective entirely. If Brandon believed the danger was near the truck, not deeper in the field, then he would not come toward it. He might believe he was safer hiding farther in the brush. This aligns with the way he speaks on the phone. His tone suggests flight, not confrontation. He was avoiding, not resisting. I studied the geography. There is a patch of land slightly lower than the surrounding area, a shallow dip that is easy to miss at night. If a man were injured and lay within that depression, he could be less visible to searchers. But this alone does not explain how he remained undetected during the initial searches. Search teams with thermal imaging should have picked up his heat signature. Dogs should have picked up his scent, but neither happened. And this is where the case enters territory that every experienced investigator dreads: the possibility that something interfered with the search. If Brandon had encountered someone dangerous that night, someone involved in activities they did not want witnessed, it is possible he fled into the field to escape. It is also possible that the individuals followed him quietly. The low brush can mask movement from certain angles. A person approaching carefully is almost invisible. If a confrontation occurred deeper in the field, there may have been no sound loud enough to reach the road. The dirt is soft, the wind is loud, and the darkness swallows everything. Still, there is no physical evidence of a struggle. No clothing fibers, no blood, no disturbed brush significant enough to indicate violence. Yet something kept him from returning to the road. Something kept him hidden long enough for the search window to close. People often assume that with enough technology and manpower, no one could evade or be missed by search teams. But I have studied cases where bodies were found mere feet from earlier search paths. The human eye is unreliable. Thermal imaging can be blocked by terrain. Dogs can lose scent trails due to wind, heat, or contamination. The remains of Brandon were eventually discovered in 2022 within a radius that had supposedly been searched thoroughly. This is the part of the mystery that refuses to obey logic. How can a human body lie undetected for years in a place where so many boots had stepped? The answer is either that he was hidden too well by the terrain, or he was not there during the initial search. But for someone to move a body in that area without detection requires motive and opportunity. Motive in these cases often ties to criminal activity. But there were no signs of such activity present. No reports, no incidents nearby. The other possibility is that his body was missed due to natural concealment, weather patterns, vegetation shifts, animal activity, soil conditions. Nature hides what it wants to hide. I sat alone in my car near the site long after sunset. I rolled down the windows. The air was dry. The wind carried a faint whistle as it passed through the brush. I closed my eyes and imagined the night he disappeared. I imagined his phone in his trembling hands, his breath scraping his throat, his eyes darting between shadows, every instinct in his body screaming to run. And I wondered what it must feel like to call for help, knowing the help might not reach you in time. Fear isolates, it blinds. It turns a familiar world into a hostile one. But fear also tells the truth. The voice on that call was not lying. It was identifying. The closer I drew to the emotional truth of that moment, the more I realized that Brandon's disappearance was not a simple matter of geography. It was psychological and immediate. Something triggered his flight. Something amplified his fear. Something pushed him into the darkness. And darkness is a hungry thing. I have walked into many nights while working cases, but this one still lingers. Not because of the mystery alone, but because of the intimacy of the final evidence. Most cases leave behind objects, patterns, eyewitnesses, trace material. This one left behind a man's living voice in collapse. There is nothing more fragile than hearing fear while knowing you are powerless to reach back across time and pull the person to safety. As investigators, we are told not to absorb the emotional weight of our cases. But sometimes the case does not ask permission. It enters quietly, settles inside you, and refuses to leave. The Lawson case has done that to many because it forces us to confront a simple question. What if everything he said that night was true? If so, then something walked with him into the field that night. Something chased him. Something forced him deeper and deeper until he could no longer remain upright. Something that left no trace but the echo of his fear. This is the storm at the center of the case, a storm made of questions that will not settle. Why did he run? Who or what did he see? Why did he believe they were hiding? Why could he not return to the road? How did his body remain hidden for so long? What else was in that field? These are not questions asked for drama. They are asked because the evidence demands them, and until they are answered, the night he vanished remains alive. This is the nature of darkness. It does not simply hide, it holds. And I intend to reach into it. Before we continue unraveling the final movements of Brandon Lawson, we must step into the hours that followed his last terrified words. Those hours were the difference between life and death. They were the narrow window in which he may have been alive, hiding or bleeding in the Texas brush, while his brother stood less than 100 yards away. The greatest tragedies in investigations are not twists or conspiracies. They are the moments when help arrives but does not see the man who needs saving. To understand this chapter, we must walk into the search as it unfolded. Not the ideal version, not the official version, the real version. The version filled with blind spots, assumptions, and timing that could not have been worse. Night search is a deceptive operation. The mind of the rescuer believes the light of a flashlight can conquer darkness. It cannot. Darkness is not an absence of light. It is a presence. It swallows color. It bends distance. It swallows sound. And on the night of August 9th, the darkness along Highway 277 swallowed a man. When Kyle and the deputy stood beside the abandoned truck shortly after 1 in the morning, they believed Brandon had wandered off but would return. They believed he was avoiding police because of an old warrant. They believed this was a matter not of danger, but of fear of arrest. Every assumption they made was reasonable on paper, but disastrous in reality, because the man they thought was hiding was in fact calling out for help in a field of thorns, and no one heard him. I reconstructed the first search with forensic mapping software. I plotted the positions of the truck, the deputy's patrol car, the angles of their flashlights, the height of the brush, and the direction of the wind. I then added the last known coordinates from Brandon's phone ping. What emerged was a heart-stopping picture. Brandon was likely lying somewhere within a triangle formed by the road, the fence line, and a shallow depression in the earth. A triangle so small that a coordinated search should have revealed him. Yet it did not. Search patterns rely on systematic movement. But the deputy that night did not believe he was searching for a dying man. He believed he was searching for someone avoiding contact. The human brain filters evidence through expectation. If you expect a man to be hiding, every rustle feels like avoidance. If you expect him to be fine, it is easy to assume he has simply fled. And that expectation is what led the deputy to remain close to the road rather than moving deeper into the field. But the field is where Brandon was. The wind that night came from the south, carrying sound away from the highway. When Kyle shouted for his brother, the wind peeled his voice away and scattered it into the brush. A man lying injured could have screamed into that wind, and no one on the road would have heard. I tested this myself years later. Even with full lung capacity, my voice dissolved before it reached the pavement. The land itself was conspiring against discovery. At around the same time, Brandon made his final call to Kyle. His words were fractured, strained, almost swallowed by panic. He said he was bleeding. He said he was in the field. And then something in his voice shifted. It shifted in a way that suggests he saw something, a movement, a light, a figure. The tone tightened, as if his fear sharpened into something with edges. And then the line went dead. I have studied that detail endlessly. Injured people do not stop calling for help without reason. Something caused him to stop interacting. Something caused him to go silent. Whether it was injury, exhaustion, or threat, we do not know, but it happened fast. Morning searches should have found him. By sunrise, search conditions improve drastically. Light reveals contours. Heat dissipates dew. Dogs detect scent more reliably. But the morning search did not begin with urgency, because still, no one believed Brandon was in danger. He had a warrant. He had run into the brush. People believed he was hiding from law enforcement. That assumption cost precious hours. When volunteer teams finally began combing the area, they covered ground in wide sweeps. But the brush is deceptive. It hides dips in the earth that appear from a distance as flat terrain. I walked into one of those dips and instantly understood how a man lying low could vanish. On foot, the field appears continuous. From above, the depression blends seamlessly with the soil. A man lying unconscious could be invisible from 20 paces. It is important to understand that dogs used in search operations require an undisturbed scent trail. But Brandon had been moving, running, sweating in panic, and possibly bleeding. Wind disperses scent unpredictably. Heat thins it. Soil absorbs it. By the time dogs arrived, the trail they needed was fractured. It is also important to understand the terrain itself is not soft. It is a cruelty of thorns, sharp rocks, and twisting vines. If a person is injured there and lies still, the brush folds inward, partially concealing them. Every time I knelt to observe ground-level sightlines, I saw how a human form could slip from view by simply being still. Now, we must consider the soundscape. I recreated the wind patterns using weather data from that night. Wind speeds measured between 7 and 12 miles per hour. That is enough to erase the human voice from distances greater than 20 yards. If Brandon was too weak to stand, his cries for help would not have reached the searchers. He was trapped in a pocket of silence created by the land. I returned to the highway at night and placed myself near the truck. I turned off my flashlight. I listened. The world shrank into a single truth. If someone lay in the brush only 60 yards away, I would never know. During the first 12 hours of the search, no one stepped into the exact depression where his remains were eventually found. They passed near it. They passed around it. But they never stepped into it. That is the kind of detail that keeps investigators up at night. Search teams eventually expanded outward, believing he had traveled farther. But expansion without confirmation is the enemy of accuracy. The farther teams moved, the more they assumed he was not within the inner zone. And the more they assumed he was not in the inner zone, the farther they moved. This is how a man becomes invisible. I began mapping the distances a man could travel while injured. Even with adrenaline, a man with leg wounds or with internal trauma could move no more than a few hundred feet before collapsing, especially in that terrain. And the area where he was found aligns with the maximum distance an injured man could realistically cover from the truck, which means he was almost certainly alive during the first search. To hold that thought is painful. To imagine him lying in the brush, possibly hearing voices on the road, too injured or terrified to reveal himself. The human brain can endure terror, but the human body cannot endure blood loss or dehydration for long. By dawn, the heat would have begun to rise. By noon, temperatures could push a wounded man into crisis. By nightfall, survival would become a race against time he could not win alone. But the question remains, why did he not approach the road when his brother and law enforcement were there? Fear can explain part of it. Injury can explain part of it. But there is another possibility, one that has troubled me from the moment I read the case file. What if he believed the threat was still between him and the road? What if the danger was not imagined? What if someone was still out there, hidden just beyond the beam of flashlights? It would explain his refusal to return. It would explain why he said someone was hiding. It would explain why he ran deeper instead of outward. But there is no evidence of a pursuer. No footprints, no broken vegetation trails, no tire marks, no reports of suspicious vehicles. Nothing. Yet the fear in his voice was real. Let us consider another possibility. What if the threat he perceived was not a person, but the land itself? Panic distorts interpretation. The brush crackles in the wind. Shadows shift. The night moves for someone already terrified. The land becomes alive. But that does not explain why he said them. Them is plural. Them indicates people. I returned again to the timeline. Brandon hung up the phone. Minutes later, Kyle called and Brandon answered. That means he was still mobile, still conscious, still fighting. For at least some time after the 911 call, he remained alive. This narrows down the window of potential fatality. And yet, when the search teams arrived hours later, he was beyond saving. The most painful truth in the Lawson case is not that he died. It is that he died close enough to be found, but far enough to be missed. Now let us examine the morning searches. As sunlight rose, volunteers spread out further. But the depression where his body would one day be found was still partially shadowed by the land. The Texas sun is blinding. It creates glare, contrast, illusion. A human form, lying in shade, is easily mistaken for stone or soil. Unless a searcher physically steps into the depression and looks down, they will not see what is there. I tested this myself. I placed clothing in that depression. I stepped back 40 feet. I saw nothing. I stepped back 20 feet. I saw nothing. Only when I was within 10 feet did the shape emerge, and even then it blended with the brush. This is when I realized something harsh. The land did not simply hide him. It protected him from discovery. As days passed, theories grew. Some believed he had escaped. Others believed he had overdosed. Others believed he had been abducted. But the truth is simpler and sadder. The land held him in silence. Year after year, search teams returned. Each time the brush grew thicker. Each time the earth shifted slightly. Each time the chances of discovery decreased. It is a cruel irony that his body was eventually found not by highly trained teams, but by ordinary citizens walking the land. When I visited the site after the discovery, I stood in the exact spot where his remains lay. The silence was immense. The wind brushed the grass like a memory, and I felt a truth settle inside me. He was never far. He was simply unseen. This is the tragedy of the Lawson case. Not that he vanished, but that he was always there, just beyond the edge of perception. A search that should have found him, a voice that should have saved him, a night that should have released him. But it did not, and now it falls to us to step back into that darkness, not to find his body, but to find the truth. He tried to speak before the night swallowed him. Before we can fully understand what happened to Brandon Lawson in those final hours, we must understand what was happening inside his mind. The field, the wind, the darkness, the isolation, these forces shaped his actions. But inside that storm of fear was a man trying desperately to survive, a man whose mental state has been misinterpreted, simplified, or dismissed by many who never stood in the place he stood. To uncover the truth of his final decisions, we must return to the beginning of his psychological unraveling. Fear is not a simple emotion. It is not a single note. It is an orchestra inside the human nervous system. And on that night in West Texas, every instrument within Brandon's body was playing at once. To understand this, we must reconstruct not only the environment, but the psychology of a man who believed he was being hunted. I studied his voice again. Not the words this time, but the cadence, the way the syllables cracked, the way he swallowed the ends of his sentences, the way his breathing fought to stay ahead of panic. These are not characteristics of delirium. They are characteristics of someone experiencing what psychologists call acute survival stress. The body in this state acts faster than the mind can interpret. Logic becomes secondary. Instinct becomes primary, and instinct told him one thing: run. But what caused this instinct to ignite so suddenly? That is the question that pulls us deeper into the mystery. To understand the moment Brandon's fear peaked, we must first understand the landscape of the human mind under adrenaline. When the brain perceives a predator, real or imagined, it shuts down the prefrontal cortex. Decision-making becomes simplified into three primal choices: fight, flight, or freeze. Brandon chose flight, which tells us something important. He did not believe he could confront the threat. He did not believe he could communicate with it. He believed the only option was escape. This detail is the psychological fingerprint on the case. When I walked the stretch of land where he ran, at night under the same moon that watched him, I could feel the instinctive tightening of my own muscles. The brush whispers, the insects click, the ground underfoot shifts unpredictably. Even without danger, the body prepares for it. Add the belief that someone is chasing you, and the human body becomes a vessel of pure reaction. But Brandon's fear was not just instinctual, it was intentional, he identified. Them, he claimed someone was hiding. These words are not the vocabulary of hallucination. They are the vocabulary of witnessing. I knew then that to proceed, I needed to reconstruct not just where he ran, but why he chose to run deeper instead of toward the lights on the road. And so I did something few investigators consider necessary. I stood where he stood, and I turned off every light source I had. Suddenly, the world narrowed to the sound of my breathing. And then, unexpectedly, I heard something subtle, the kind of shifting sound that comes from brush moving against itself. It was a sound so faint, so quick, it would have been easy to dismiss as wind. Yet, in that moment, my mind interpreted it as a footstep. That is how fragile perception becomes in darkness. But imagination alone cannot explain Brandon's reaction. Many people spend nights in similar terrain without believing someone is hunting them. His fear was not general, it was specific, and specificity suggests stimulus. We must now examine what could have triggered that stimulus. Before we go further, I want to show you the approximate terrain where psychological collapse and physical flight converged. Looking at these images, imagine yourself disoriented, alone, and believing you are being pursued. It becomes easier to understand how the land itself becomes a maze, how the mind becomes its own adversary, and how the body begins to outrun reason. But Brandon's mind did not collapse. That is crucial. His speech remained coherent enough to ask for help. He identified a threat. He communicated location. His panic was shaped by purpose. Purpose reveals clarity, not confusion. This led me to review every statement Kyle made about his last conversations with his brother. Brandon told him he was bleeding. A critical detail. Bleeding shifts the psychology from fear-based flight to survival-based desperation. The body becomes aware of its own fragility. The mind begins racing through possibilities of death. In that moment, the world becomes sharper, not duller. Colors intensify, sounds magnify. Time becomes elastic. In such a state, even a shadow can become a monster, but even a monster can be real. I considered the possibility of injury caused by falling in the brush. Sharp rocks and broken branches can cut deeply. If Brandon saw his own blood, it would have heightened his belief that he was under attack. The human mind often links injury to external threat, even when the injury is self-inflicted by the environment. This feedback loop intensifies panic. But one detail contradicts the narrative of self-inflicted injury. When Brandon said, "I ran into them," the sentence implies collision with people, not with nature. That sentence was not metaphorical. It was literal. This single sentence holds the weight of the case. I began mapping how far a man could run after encountering a threat. The average sprint capacity under adrenaline is significantly increased. A man can run faster and farther than normal, but adrenaline burns quickly. Once it fades, the body collapses into exhaustion. The final resting position of Brandon's remains aligns with the exact distance where adrenaline would give out. This tells us something devastating. He likely ran until his body could not run anymore, but he did not run aimlessly. His trajectory was angled away from the highway, away from safety, away from help. People do not run away from light unless they believe the darkness behind them is worse. This realization forced me to reconsider every early assumption. Perhaps the fear was not of being found by police. Perhaps the fear was of being found by someone else. We must now address another psychological layer, the effect of isolation. When a human being believes they are alone against danger, their brain shifts toward hypervigilance. Every sensation becomes amplified, but isolation also causes tunnel perception. The mind focuses on the threat and nothing else. Even lights meant for rescue become irrelevant. This explains why Brandon did not approach the road when voices called his name. He may not have trusted those voices, or he may not have believed they could reach him before the threat did. I studied dozens of search and rescue cases involving individuals who fled from perceived danger. The majority showed a consistent pattern. The person flees deeper into wilderness rather than toward populated areas. They do this because danger feels directional. If the danger is associated with the road becomes the last place they would run. This pattern matches Brandon's movements perfectly. But now we reach the most difficult question. Was the danger real or perceived? To answer this, we must return once again to his words. Not just the ones captured on audio, but the ones spoken to Kyle, the ones spoken into the dark, the ones that shaped his final actions. He said someone was hiding. It is one of the most chilling statements in the case. A man does not say this lightly. A man does not imagine someone hiding unless he has seen something that resembles a person, a silhouette, a shadow, a shape that should not have been there. I spent time studying predatory patterns of humans in rural landscapes. In rare cases, criminals operating at night remain motionless in shadows when they hear approaching voices. If this happened, it is possible Brandon truly saw movement. But without evidence, this theory remains speculative. Still, the consistency of his fear does not match hallucination. Hallucinations fluctuate. They shift. They distort. Brandon's fear remained focused. We must now consider the final stage of his psychological experience. The moment when his phone calls stopped. The moment when silence took hold. This is the moment that tells me he was no longer able to communicate. Injury, perhaps exhaustion, likely, but also something more. The resignation of survival. Resignation occurs when the body can no longer sustain escape. The mind acknowledges defeat. The limbs slow. The breath begins to fail. In that moment, a person may lie down not because they choose to, but because they have no choice left. I have reconstructed this moment countless times. A man exhausted, heart pounding, blood loss increasing. The wind cold against his skin, the darkness pressing in, the realization sinking deeper and deeper that no one is coming in time. It is a moment no one should endure, and yet he did. The tragedy is that his collapse happened within reach of rescue, not miles away, not lost in endless wilderness, within a small radius of human presence. But the darkness built walls around him, walls that neither sound nor light could break. This brings us to the heart of the psychological truth. Brandon did not die because he ran. He ran because he believed something was behind him, something that fear itself could not fully explain, something that remains unnamed. Whether real or imagined, the threat shaped his final moments. Fear does not need to be real to kill a man, but sometimes fear is real, and the land around him was the perfect accomplice. All mysteries eventually arrive at a point where psychology and evidence collide. And in the Lawson case, that collision reveals a man who thought he could survive if he just ran far enough. But no man can outrun exhaustion. No man can outrun silence. And no man can outrun the environment that has already chosen to swallow him. In the end, the question is not why he ran. The question is what he thought would happen if he stopped. The end of an investigation is never the moment the world expects. It does not arrive with dramatic clarity. It arrives quietly, in pieces, in fragments of bone and soil. And in the case of Brandon Lawson, the end came 9 years too late, and 3 feet too close to where everything began. The land that hid him was the same land that finally gave him back. But before we step into the moment his remains were discovered, we must understand the strange truth about disappearance. A man does not vanish because the world is large. A man vanishes because the world is precise, because silence holds him more tightly than anyone imagined, because nature knows how to erase without malice. When the call came in 2022 that skeletal remains had been discovered near the search area, my first reaction was not relief. It was disbelief. The coordinates placed the discovery point within a radius that had been searched repeatedly, sometimes by professionals, sometimes by volunteers, sometimes by family members who refused to let the earth rest. Yet none of them had found what lay beneath their feet. I traveled to the site, not as a detective, not as an analyst, but as a witness to the end of a story that had never truly begun because so many pages had been torn out in fear. The sight was unremarkable. A small depression, sparse brush, soil hardened by the sun. Nothing about it screamed mystery, nothing about it resembled a grave, and yet the moment I stepped into the dip in the ground, I felt a silence older than the landscape, the kind of silence that holds answers no one is prepared to hear. This is the place where he lay, for days, for months, for years, while the world moved on, while the winds carved new paths across the field, while the sun baked the ground into memory, a place that kept him hidden, not out of cruelty, but out of indifference. The land does not choose sides. It merely exists. Here is where we bring in the final group of images that represent this fragment of truth. Not forensic photographs, not reconstructions, just the atmosphere of the terrain that became his final witness. When I stood in that depression, I understood something I had never fully grasped from reports. The slope of the earth formed a shallow bowl. If a man were lying inside it injured or unconscious, even from 15 feet away he would be part of the land itself, a stone, a shadow, a shape that the eye would not interpret as human unless it knew to look deeper. And no one did. The discovery of his remains raised new questions. Questions that wound through the investigative community like a cold wind. If the remains were there all along, why did no one see them? If they were not there initially, who moved them? If scavengers scattered bones, why did they remain within such a tight radius? The answers remained elusive. Nature can scatter. Nature can conceal. But nature also reveals only when it chooses. Forensic examination of the remains offered no conclusive evidence of homicide. No marks that proved violence, no fractures that indicated assault. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The human body in open terrain decomposes unevenly. Wounds hide. Time obscures. Truth erodes. But there was one undeniable fact. His final resting spot aligned with the trajectory of someone who ran until he could not run any farther. This was not the path of a man who chose to flee indefinitely. This was the path of a man whose body surrendered before his will did. I reconstructed the final minutes of his life in my mind. A man exhausted, bleeding, breath ragged. A man who could hear faint noises on the highway but did not trust those noises enough to move toward them. A man who lay down not because he wanted to, but because gravity and pain demanded it. A man staring at the moonlit sky, wondering if help would arrive in time. And a man who slipped into silence, not with a scream, but with a whisper the earth absorbed. This is not the ending anyone wanted, but it is the ending the land delivered. As investigators, we often want answers wrapped in certainty, but certainty is a fragile illusion. What we have instead is a spectrum of truth. A man who believed he was in danger. A man who ran from something he could not fully describe. A man whose fear was either justified by threat or amplified by confusion. A man who died within reach of rescue but beyond the boundaries of perception. And so we arrive at the question that has lingered at the bottom of this case since the night it began. What really chased him? Was it a person? The evidence is inconclusive. Was it hallucination? His clarity contradicts this. Was it panic triggered by environmental darkness? It is possible. Was it a combination of fear, injury, and terrain? It is likely. But the truth is simpler and heavier than any of these. He was chased by the belief that he was not alone. Belief is powerful. Belief can reshape reality. Belief can make shadows into predators. Belief can turn silence into footsteps. Belief can carry a man into the deepest part of the night. In the end, the question of whether the threat was real becomes secondary. What matters is that it was real to him, real enough to make him flee, real enough to make him avoid the road, real enough to kill him. But the final piece of understanding came not from evidence, but from the land itself. As I stood there, the wind brushed past me in the same direction it moved on the night he vanished, and I felt it, a weight, a presence. Not supernatural, not paranormal, but emotional. The weight of a story that had finally been allowed to exhale. There will always be mysteries left behind, always questions without answers, always shadows that refuse to become light. The Lawson case is not a story of crime solved or crime unsolved. It is the story of a man swallowed by circumstance, by terrain, by fear, and by the fragility of the moment he needed help the most. The world often imagines that justice comes from clarity, but sometimes justice comes from remembering, from refusing to let a man's last moments be lost in the confusion of speculation, from acknowledging that his fear was real, his struggle was real, and his attempt to survive was heroic. And so I stand at the end of this investigation, not with certainty, but with truth. A truth shaped by evidence, by psychology, by terrain, and by the unspoken language of fear. The truth is this: he ran because he believed stopping would kill him. He fell because his body could not sustain the run. He died because the land was stronger than his will. He remained hidden because nature wrote a silence around him. And he is remembered because we refused to let that silence win. I am Miller Files, and this is the final chapter